Ronald Reagan was so far left, at one point the FBI was following him.
Do you remember sort of what you were thinking, what appealed to you at that time about Marxism?
Yes, I mean, there was no alternative being discussed.
I treated my interview with him as Thomas Sowell 101. I wanted it to be for the new generation of young people who watch YouTube, who listen to podcasts.
My first job was as a Western Union messenger. So I would take the Fifth Avenue bus. It would go all the way up Fifth Avenue, past all these Lord and Taylor and all these fancy places. And then I would cross 57th Street, down Riverside Drive. And then as I came across this long viaduct that turned into 135th Street, suddenly there were the tenements. And I wondered, why is this? It's so different. And nothing in the schools or most of the books seemed to deal with that, and Marx dealt with that.
There's an absolutely beautiful moment where I ask him about his own political evolution.
So then what was your wake-up to what was wrong with that line of thinking?
Facts.
I love that moment. I mean, I knew the second he did it, I was like, we got our clip. That's as good as it gets. And it gets to, what does this man care about most? Does he care about how he feels about things, how he wants the world to be, or how is the world as it is? Because that's what he's saying. I care about facts. The world is a certain way, and now, using that as the baseline, we can try to figure out how to make things better.
Drafted in 1951, Tom joined the Marines, where he taught pistol shooting and took photographs. In fact, Sowell was part of the Marine Corps Combat Camera Division.
Combat Camera is responsible for the historical documentation. It may not necessarily make it out to the local paper, but somewhere down the line, someone might be able to pull up an image and say, okay, this happened during this time frame. The imagery is used as good reference to anything we may need in the future or something that's happening right now.
Although Thomas Sowell left the Marines long ago, his legacy lives on today with some members of the Combat Camera Corps, who as young men discovered Sowell's work.
When I was a young person, I used to like to stay home from school occasionally, like to play hooky or pretend I was sick and stay home. But unlike most kids who'd, cut class and do whatever, I would watch videos of Thomas Sowell on Milton Friedman's show, Free to Choose, and he would just wipe the floor with people from the other side of the aisle that didn't seem like know what they were talking about. These were very smart people, but Thomas Sowell was so much smarter and so much more intelligent and so much more articulate that he would just make them seem like bumbling idiots, and I just thought that was awesome.
When the private sector fails to create jobs at a fast enough rate, you find that people are unemployed and drift into needing help. I think it is overly broad to say that we turn people into helpless children.
I don't remember talking to anyone who's ever been on welfare who didn't think they were being treated like children while they were on it.
The lessons Sowell learned in the Marines would stay with him for the rest of his life, especially his love of photography, which would become Tom's artistic outlet while he pursued a life filled with studying facts and data.
Photography did have connections to his vision of reality. Tom once commented to me that to be a photographer, you have to master trade-offs. All of the little adjustments that you fiddle with in the camera never involve making everything better or everything worse. It's a matter of trading one thing off for another. If you close down the diaphragm, then you get lots and lots of stuff in focus, near to far. On the other hand, you're cutting down the amount of light. And a theme in Tom's work on society is that all policies involve trade-offs, and Tom often loses patience at people with sweeping visions. Here's how we can improve society. Here's a solution to a problem. And Tom points out in his political writings, there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. Just like photography.
The University of Chicago is hallowed ground for Thomas Sowell. Here's where some of the most influential economic philosophies of modern times were formed. It's called the Chicago School of Economics. And it's where Tom would be mentored by intellectual giants like George Stigler and Milton Friedman, both of whom would go on to win the Nobel Prize in economics.
I was a graduate student here from 1960 to 64. The thing I learned as a graduate student was economics is straightforward and simple when you grasp its underlying logic. And secondly, that logic can be applied seriously to understand many different things about the world.
You know, in Chicago, if it was true because you could prove it was true. It was true because you had the evidence, you had the logic, and so forth. They explored the specific ways in which the market does and doesn't work. The idea, you know, that people are rational on the whole, and that if you allow those people to operate in the marketplace, you'll generally get better results.
The Chicago School of Economics is where Tom says he understood the importance of discipline and the importance of getting hard data. In fact, he talks more positively about his experience at University of Chicago than at Harvard, where he says a lot of people, in his opinion, went on emotion. Tom was a Marxist when he took a course with Milton Friedman, and at the end of the course, he remained a Marxist. But what he appreciated was that at University of Chicago, economics was a full contact sport where you had to defend your position rigorously, otherwise you got wasted. And so at least Tom Sowell said he came out understanding the importance of hard data.
I mean, I was still a Marxist after taking Milton Friedman's course. But one summer in the government was enough to let me say, no, this government is really not the answer. I mean, that is...
Milton Friedman didn't cure you, but the federal government did.
The federal government did.
So
never say the federal government doesn't do anything. My first professional job, I was a summer intern at the U.S. Department of Labor. One of my biggest concerns was about minimum wages. At first, I thought, well, this is good because all these people are poor and they'll get a little higher income, and so that'll be helpful. And then as I studied economics, I began to see, well, there's a downside. They may lose their jobs completely, so that is that. When I was at the Labor Department, I tried to talk about that to them, and eventually I came up with some test of it. And when I came up with how we might test this, I was waiting to hear congratulations, you see, that I had this. And I could see these people were stunned. They said, oh, this idiot has stumbled on something that will ruin us all. And I realized the U.S. Department of Labor had its own agenda and interests. And that did not necessarily mean that whether poor people lost their jobs from minimum wages or got higher pay was their highest priority.
Tom Sowell looked at the data, and the data found that minimum wage hikes cause people who are unskilled to lose jobs. He found out that people in the government didn't give a rip whether or not it worked or didn't work. They were simply implementing the policy. And that's what shocked him and caused him to begin to rethink lots of his assumptions. So it wasn't academia that caused him to become more conservative. It was real life working for the government.
I was now beginning to understand things I hadn't understood before.
Tom, as I said, got his PhD here in 1968. He actually taught in the years leading up to that at Cornell, which feeds back also to this just tumultuous times in the 1960s in the country. Huge demonstrations at Cornell actually shut down the university for some time.
In 1965, Thomas Sowell took a teaching position at Cornell. Like many other colleges, it became a focal point for anti-war and anti-discrimination protests and demonstrations. When armed black students took over a building on campus, Sowell had little sympathy for school administrators. Blacks had been recruited to Cornell under lower standards to diversify the student body. And Sowell observed that many of these same students were now causing trouble and feeding racial divisions. For Sowell, it was an example of the unintended consequences of affirmative action. Tom's tenure at Cornell had a very profound impact on him, particularly surrounding the campus protests. I think it left a very, very bitter taste in his mouth.
Yes, I think it did. He discovered that many black students at Cornell, their SAT scores were above the average, but they are having problems at Cornell. And that's when he first came up with the idea of people being mismatched. That is, black students who would do very well at other schools, but were recruited in the name of affirmative action to schools where they were in over their heads.
The average black student at MIT is in the bottom 10% of MIT students in math, but he is in the top 90% of all American students in math. Something like 1/4 of all the black students going to MIT do not graduate. You're talking about a pool of people whom you are artificially turning into failures by mismatching them with the school.
Tom had moved to UCLA to escape the turmoil at Cornell and then jumped into the turmoil at UCLA. I was sitting in my office at UCLA one day when the Black Student Association delegation marched into his office. I heard all of this. And one of them said, "Well, how you doing, brother?" "Tom, just a minute. I am not your brother. I am Mr. Sowell, and you will address me that way." Boy, was that a shock to those folks. Here was their natural ally laying down the law. You're going to treat me the way I'm going to treat you, as another human being face to face. And if you don't like that, you can leave.
I first met Tom in 1969 when I was a student at UCLA. I just walked in his office one day and I said that I understand that you and I have similar ideas on matters of economics. And we started talking from there.
You and Sowell used to joke about how few black conservatives there were in the country back in the 70s and 80s. Has much changed since then, and what was it like back then?
There were relatively few blacks that we knew of that were kind of free market, limited government. It was Bill Buckley who made the suggestion that the EPA does not allow Tom Sowell and I to fly on one plane together because we're endangered species.
Tom's done something in his career that one of his mentors, Milton Friedman, felt was important to do also, and that is share his knowledge of economics with non-economists, with non-intellectuals.
The true test of whether someone understands a subject, the true test comes when he can explain it to someone who does not know a darn thing about it. And Tom has the gift of being able to do that, to be able to explain potentially complex ideas in economics to the ordinary person.
I haven't been able to find a single country in the world where the policies that are being advocated for blacks in the United States have lifted any people out of poverty. I've seen many examples around the world of people who began in poverty and ended in affluence. Not one of them has followed any pattern at all like what is being advocated for blacks in the United States. Many groups have remained in poverty for a very long time, trying to follow those patterns.
At one time, black Americans did not have the constitutional guarantees as everybody else. Now we do. But because the civil rights struggle is over and won, and we're not facing the kind of gross racial discrimination of the past, does not mean that they're not major problems. I'm very sure that Tom would say that the 75% rate of illegitimacy among blacks is a devastating problem, but it's not a racial problem. It's not a legacy of slavery. The crime that I believe Tom would say as well, that the crime we see in many black communities is a devastating problem, but it has nothing to do with racial discrimination.
If you have always believed that everyone should play by the same rules and be judged by the same standards, that would have gotten you labeled a radical 50 years ago, a liberal 25 years ago, and a racist today.
Thomas Sowell may be an intellectual, but it would be a mistake to believe that only academics and economists believe in what Tom has to say.
I never heard, never damaged. I am most certainly handed single.
In a small recording studio just outside of downtown Dallas, a young rapper hones his craft.
It feels good to be back in this booth. And shout out to you. You back in me, then you back in the truth. You actually knew. And I ain't have to tell you, so sit back, let it soothe the immaculate dude.
Eric July is a man on a mission.
Hand is singly top tier, meaning you not.
Eric is out to make great music and to educate people like himself about his hero.
And I'm something like a great how. Anywhere Thomas Sowell is, he's the smartest person in the room. I would most definitely just tell him that he's been my biggest inspiration, hands down.